And welcome to our learning today for Purim, the 14th of Adar, the 26th of February, as we open up with the laws, Hilchis Gerushin, the laws of divorce. I should point out that when we talk about the laws of divorce, it's interesting that there are religions where divorce is considered a sin, a bad thing. It's not possible, sanctified by God. It is not the Jewish approach. It is one of the mitzvahs is how to do a divorce. On the other hand, we know, of course, what the Gemara tells us, that when a couple separates, the Mizbeach sheds tears. Hashem says, rather erase my name in the story of the Seita than God forbid, a couple separating. So when it's necessary, it is a holy thing and a good thing to be done. But when we can avoid it, that is, of course, definitely preferable. Just a bit of an intro to that. Okay, let's jump right in. Pull up the screen here. Hilchis Gerushin, Hakdama. There are two mitzvahs here. One is when we can avoid it. 1 second, sorry there. The idea is that the first mitzvah is the divorce, the bill of divorce that he gives. And the negative mitzvah, the prohibition, is that after a divorcee remarries, she marries someone else, then her first husband is now forbidden from marrying her again. Okay, so there's no going back and forth. These mitzvahs are explained in the chapters that follow. Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph. Eino isha mesgareshes ela bichsov sheyegia lo. A woman may be divorced only by receiving a written bill of divorce. This bill is called a get. And the Torah establishes 10 principles as fundamentals for divorce to be effective. And they are: 1, a man must voluntarily initiate the divorce. 2, he must effect the divorce by means, meaning he can't be forced to. He must effect the divorce by means of a written document and through no other means. C, the document must communicate that he is divorcing his wife and releasing her from his domain. D, it should utterly sever the connection between the husband and his wife. E, the get should be written for the sake of the woman being divorced. So it has to be absolute. F, once the get is written, there should be no action necessary except it's transferred to the woman. That's all that's left. G, he should actually transfer the get to her. He has to give it to her. H, he has to transfer the get to her in the presence of the witnesses. I, that he should actually transfer it to her for the sake of divorce. And J, that the husband or his agent should be the one who gives it to her. Okay. Those are the 10 principles, and now we're going to go into a lot of detail around it. The other requirements of a get, in other words, dating the debt, get correctly, having it signed by witnesses and the like, are all rabbinic institutions. And now the Rambam is going to extrapolate from the verses all of these 10 laws. What are the sources that indicate these 10 requirements stem from Scripture itself? They're derived from Deuteronomy, which states that if it comes to pass that she does not find favor in his eyes, he will write a bill of divorce for her, place it in her hand, and send her from his home. If she does not find favor in his eyes, this indicates that he divorces her only on his own initiative. If a woman is divorced against her husband's will, the divorce is invalid. A woman may, however, be divorced either voluntarily or against her will. And as we'll read, Rabbeinu Gershom said, you cannot divorce a woman without her consent, and that is the practice followed in the Ashkenazi community and in most communities from a rabbinic perspective. And he will write. This means that a woman can only be divorced by means of a written document. For her, v'chasav law, it should be written for her sake. Sefer Krisos, a bill of divorce, in other words, a deed that severs the relationship between the husband and his wife without leaving him any jurisdiction over her. If the relationship between them is not entirely severed, the divorce is not effective, as will be explained. 1 second.
Can't hear you, Rabbi.
Sorry, he will place it in her hand. This teaches that she is not divorced until the bill of divorce is placed in her hand, in the hand of her agent, which is considered to be her hand, or in her domain, which is considered to be her hand, as will be explained. And he will send her, teaches us that the wording of the get indicates he is sending her away, not that he is sending himself away from her. He has to be sending her. What do we mean by that? Valid. What is implied? If he writes to her, behold, you are sent away. Behold, you are divorced. You are now independent. You are now permitted to marry any man, or the like. The divorce is effective. The essence of the text of a get is the statement, you are now permitted to any man. If, by contrast, he writes to her, I am no longer your husband, or I am no longer the one who consecrates you, or I am no longer your man, the divorce is not effective. And he will send her implies that he should not himself send himself away from her. Similarly, if a man writes to the wife, behold, you are free, the divorce is not effective. In other words, it has to be clear that he is sending her. Hey, the text expression that he will send her from his home does not mean that the divorce doesn't become effective until she leaves his home. Instead, the divorce becomes effective when the get reaches the woman's hand, even though she's still living in the husband's home, as will be explained. And he will send her, teaches that if he divorces her, but doesn't send her away from his home, it is as if he divorced her and then remarried her, and therefore she requires another get, as will be explained. Okay, so the second get is what it teaches, but the first get was effective. What is the source that teaches that once the get is written, there should be no action necessary except its transfer? It's the sequence of the verses, v'chasav and v'nosan. He will write and he will place, indicating that a get is acceptable only when the only things that are lacking are writing and transfer. This excludes an article that must be detached after it's been written. What do we mean by that? So he gives some strange examples. Therefore, if a man writes a get on the horn of a cow, he must give his wife the cow for the divorce to be effective. If he cuts off the horn after he wrote the get on it, then it's not effective. Similarly, if he wrote a get on a plant that was still attached to its source of nurture, the divorce is not effective. And this applies even if the witness is signed after it was detached. Now, again, just to point out, the opposite, the Rambam here is referring to examples of things that are done in that way. But it's not obviously not ideal, as we'll read it later in the Rambam, that the laws of Gittin are quite complex and are supposed to be written on parchment, etc., etc., etc. Zayin, in case of Mechuber, we may not even write the standard text of a get on an article that is attached to its source of nurture. If a scribe writes the standard text of a get on an article that is attached to its source of nurture, detaches it, and afterwards writes the name of the husband and the wife, the date, and the words, behold, you are permitted to marry any man, and the witness is signed, and it was given to her, it is acceptable. Okay? So you should not write anything on the get. But if he did it in this way, excuse me, meaning if he wrote it, but he left out the key identifying information, he wrote it obviously for them, but he left out their names and filled in the key identifying information. Once he had separated it, then it's okay. Again, acceptable does not mean it's good. It just means after the fact, it can be used. If the husband writes the get on a leaf growing in a flower pot with a hole at the bottom, the get is unacceptable, even if he gives her the entire flower pot. Now, in halacha, many times that Rambam refers, you may remember it from previous times, he refers to this idea of the flower pot with the hole. What is it? It's basically something which is considered karka, ground, earth, even though it's in a pot. Meaning it's in the earth, but in a pot. So because there are holes in the pot, which now connect the earth in the pot with the earth that it's connected to, it's considered like it's growing on the ground. This is a decree lest one detach the leaf. And therefore, it won't be kosher. He may, however, write the get on the pottery of the flower pot and give it to her. Uminayin test. So what is the source that teaches that the get must be given to her for the sake of divorce? Because the pasuk says, "Sefer krisas v'nasa beyada." A bill of divorce placed in her hand, implying he must place it in her hand for the sake of divorce. If, however, he gave it to her as a promissory note or as a mezuzah, or he placed it in her hand while she was sleeping and she awoke and discovered it in her hand, the get is void. If, however, he told her afterwards when she wakes up and she sees the get in her hand, he tells her, "This is your get," the divorce is effective. Now, Yud. Remember, just to reiterate the obvious, the Rambam is referring to again and again the b'diavad. After the fact, it is still kosher, but is not optimal. Yud. 10. The above principle must be clarified in the context of the following law. If a man tells the witnesses, "See the get I'm giving her," and he then tells his wife, "Take this promissory note," the get is effective, for he has told the witnesses that he was given to her for the sake of divorce. He told her that it was a promissory note only because he was embarrassed to face her. Okay? Now, again, this is all going back to, I think it's Halacha Daled, where the Rambam says that a woman does not need to consent. But contemporary Halacha has evolved past that since Rabbeinu Gershom, and she has to accept willingly. Amagadish, Yudalef. The time he gives the get, the man who divorces his wife must tell her, "Behold your get, this is your get," or "This is your get," or the like. If he places the get in her hand without saying anything, the get is not acceptable. When does the above apply? When the husband was not speaking to her about divorce immediately beforehand. If, however, he had been speaking to her about divorce, they showed up at the Bezdin, they're sitting there, he puts it into her hand, and he takes the get and places it in her hand without saying anything, the divorce is acceptable because we can go with the assumption that she knows what it was for. It's the following rules apply when a get has been placed on the ground and the husband tells her, "Pick up, there's your get." Or it was tied to his hand, to his thigh, and she takes it from him. Even if after it reaches her possession, he tells her, "Behold, this is your get," it is void. Why? The rationale is that it is written, he will place it in her hand, implying she may not take it on her own accord. It has to be his act, not hers. And in these instances, neither the husband nor his agent gave it to her. Now, I should point out, if, however, he points her body towards her, or tilts his hand until she takes it and says, "Behold, this is your get," the get is effective. So if he leans forward. Now, I should point out that later on, the Rambam will discuss, let's say she's standing in her property and he throws it. She's in her house. He throws it over the fence into her yard. He says, "Here's your get," and it lands inside her yard, which is her property. That can be a way of him giving it to her. And then she picks it up from the ground. The issue isn't the ground. The issue is she's the one who's initiating the transfer. That's the problematic. What is the source that teaches that it has to be given in front of witnesses? Because it says, according to the words of two witnesses or through those of three witnesses, it will be established. It is possible. Sorry, it is impossible. And the Rambam gives a very interesting reasoning to this. That a woman will be considered to be forbidden in sexual relations with her, punishable by execution. And if she has a child with a man, it'll be a mamzer. Why? Because she's married. And the next day, she can go and marry anyone she wants. Unless the divorce is observed by witnesses. Meaning such a powerful transformation in her status needs to be verified. Meaning it needs to have the authority of an outside witness. Therefore, if a husband gives his wife a get in private, or even if exchange is observed by one witness, the divorce is utterly void. When does the above apply? When the get is written by a scribe. When, however, the husband writes the get himself, one witness signs it, and the husband gives it to her, the get is unacceptable only by rabbinic decree, and the woman is forbidden to marry a priest. In other words, if the husband would die now, and she was a widow, which would have been allowed to marry a kohen, she would not be allowed to marry a kohen. Why? Because her divorce would be considered. Okay. Tesvav. Any questions? We're covering a lot of material today. Anybody want to ask anything? Oh, good. It is an ordinance enacted by our sages that the Eidim should sign a get, lest the husband gives a get in the presence of two witnesses and they die. In such an instance, a get she possesses no more than a shard, but there's no witness to testify to its authenticity. To prevent such a situation, our sages ordained that the testimony regarding the authenticity of the get should be contained within it. Although witnesses have signed within, the husband must give the get to his wife in the presence of two witnesses, whether the same witnesses who signed it or two others. For in essence, divorce is established by virtue of the witnesses who observe the transfer of the get. And here, this is a very interesting discussion in the Talmud. We know, generally in halacha, that the concept of edim, there are two types of edim. There's edei birur and edei kiyum, verifying witnesses and establishing witnesses. So, for example, if I borrow money from you, why do I owe? On what basis do I owe the money to you? Because I borrowed the money. The witnesses are just there to establish the fact that I actually did take the loan. With a marriage or a divorce, the witnesses aren't there only to verify, but they establish, they create the marriage. In other words, if nobody saw when you lent me that $100, do I owe it to you? 100%. I can try to deny it. I can play games because there's no way to verify it. But a marriage, if there weren't Adam, you're not married. If there's no Adam to the get, there's no get. Yeah. Chasmu bay. If two witnesses sign the get and the husband transgresses and gives the get to his wife in private, or if it is discovered the witnesses who observed to transfer the get were unsuitable, the divorce is affected. Why? For the witnesses who signed the get are acceptable, and the get exists in the woman's possessions. However, some of the Gedolim ruled the get is unacceptable because the witnesses weren't there. If the witnesses who signed the get are unsuitable, or even if one was unsuitable and one was acceptable, and the husband gave it to her in the presence of two acceptable witnesses, the get is unacceptable. It is as if it were a forgery. It's like a forgery. That's the extent to which the Rambam is supporting the significance of the witnesses who are there. Excuse me. That's why the Beth Din here, when they do divorces, most Beth Din, they have. It's not like a wedding where, you bring the witnesses, and you ask the family, who do you want to be as witnesses for the divorce? There are two designated people who come for every divorce because their role that they play there is so critical, in a way even more critical than a marriage. Because at the end of the day, let's say a couple gets married and there's a problem with the ksuba, there's a problem with the wedding, right? Let's say it wasn't a kosher wedding, right? There's no real damage being done when you think about it, because the children are still kosher Jewish children. The fact that they're being born out of a halachic wedlock, okay, it's not ideal, but it's not a train smash to the level. If there's a problem with the get, if the Edom weren't good there, right? And then the woman goes and marries someone else after this divorce. She has kids. Those kids are mamzerim. So that's why a divorce. I mean, I officiate at weddings with no rabbinic oversight. You make a wedding, you learn your halachas, you were trained, you do it. Gittin, very, very different. Rabbi Smith flies from Johannesburg, Rabbi Kurtztag used to, for every single get, because the severity of a get is far, far greater than the severity of a marriage, for that reason. And therefore the proficiency in the halachas and the execution of them is all the more important. Yudches, here chikas eidim. If the witnesses sign the get at a position more than 2 lines away from the text of the get, is unacceptable. It has to be close. How far away beneath can the witnesses sign? Less than 2 lines, so that their names will always be read together with the text. When did this disqualification mentioned above apply? When the get is in the woman's possession, there are witnesses who observed its transfer. If, however, the husband gave his wife the get in the presence of witnesses, the get is acceptable even if the witnesses' signatures are far removed from the text, because you have other eidim. Moreover, this ruling applies, and they're around. This ruling applies even when there were not any witnesses who signed the get, for in essence, divorce is affected by the virtue of the witnesses who observe the transfer of the get. In other words, even if they're not around, but if we know they were there, the get is still a kasher get. So the eidim that watch the get are most important. You test. It is required to read the get aloud in the presence of the witnesses who observe its transfer. Afterwards, the get can take hours. Afterwards, it should be given to her. If it was given to her in their presence, it should be taken from her and read aloud after it was given to her. The following rule applies when the witnesses read the get while it is in the possession of the husband or his agent and they return it to him. If he encloses it within his hand, obscuring it from the witness's view, and then gives it to her, they should read it again. In other words, the witnesses need to read every single word on that document immediately before the husband hands it to the wife. In the latter instance, if they didn't read it, the husband hid it, put it into his pocket, then he took it out. We don't know if it's the same paper. Then he gives it to her. And it was thrown into the sea. The divorce is effective. Why? Since the witnesses read it first, we do not suspect that it was exchanged for another document. And moreover, even if the husband says, it was another document that I gave her, it wasn't the get that you read, his word is not accepted and the divorce is effective, because the assumption is he's just saying that in order to make his life miserable. If, however, they didn't read the get beforehand, the husband gives it to the wife in their presence, and then it's thrown into the fire of the sea, the status of the divorce is doubtful. And this applies even if the husband says that it was an acceptable get, and therefore she would need to get another get. Chav Bey, Zarek la get l'chatzera. If he threw the get into the woman's courtyard among barrels in the presence of witnesses, and when they looked for it, they found a mezuzah or another document, we do not suspect that she's been divorced. Rather, we assume that the article that was found was the one that was thrown. If 2 or 3 mezuzah documents were discovered there, and we suspect that perhaps he threw a get and it was dragged away by mice, the status of the woman's divorce is in doubt. Okay. Chav Gimel. The witnesses who sign the get must know how to read and sign their names. If they don't know how to read and sign, we read the get in the presence and they sign, provided they understand the wording of the get, even if they're not proficient in writing. Again, another big issue around the get is the actual writing, the most complicated form of writing, because the document has such power. Rabbi Suiza was a professional get scribe. Now, obviously, you need to make other arrangements, but it's not just anything just because you know how to write the Sefer Torah Mezuzah, can you write a get. If they don't know how to sign their names, we write out the signatures for them on the paper with spiller, with thousands of substances to hold, leave a permanent mark, and they sign their name over these markings. This practice is not followed with regard to other legal documents. It is a leniency adopted with regard to bills of divorce that a Yiddish woman shall Yibneis Yisrael agunais, in order she should not be forced to live without a marriage partner. This leniency is granted because the signature of witnesses on a bill of divorce is a rabbinic institution, as we explained, and therefore the rabbis can exercise their discretion to be lenient on a law which in any event is their creation. All the signature of witnesses on the bill as the rabbinic institutions are sages to ordain that the witnesses state their name in the get. Full name. Similarly, the witnesses get must sign in the presence of each other. If either signs out to other, the get is unacceptable. Both names, both spelled out fully in the presence of each other. Similarly, our sages ordain that the date of a get and the place where it is written is recorded within it, as it is required with regard to other legal documents. And this was required lest one's wife also be one's relative and she committed adultery, because of the husband's feelings for his wife, he might conceivably write her a get after she had committed adultery and give it to her. If the get was not dated, she could say, I was divorced before I committed adultery. So to prevent this from happening, our sages ordained that the gittin be dated. You cannot backdate a get. Chafei. In all the following instances, a get is unacceptable. 1, a get signed by witnesses that is not dated. 2, a get that is predated or postdated. 3, one that was written during the day and signed the following night. This applies even if they're involved in the matter of the divorce until the get was signed. 4, the get was written in Jerusalem and the scribe erred and wrote that it was written in Lud. It's not the correct city. For a get to be acceptable, it is necessary that it be signed at the time it was written and in the place where it was written. It all has to happen there. Chavav. A get is acceptable if the husband cut off the portion of the get that contained the gate and gave it to her, or didn't write the date, merely the week, the first or the second week of a given month, or he specified merely the month or merely the year without mentioning the month, or even if he specified merely the 7-year cycle in which the get was composed, it's okay still, it's not ideal. Similarly, get is acceptable if the husband writes within today a divorce, then this implies the day on which the get was released. Chav Zayin. Similarly, our sages ordained that the year of the ruling kingdom at that time should be mentioned in a get to gain the favor of the ruling authorities. In other words, every king would establish a calendar on their ruling. The following rules apply if a person writes a get and dated it according to the years of a kingdom other than that of his locale, according to the years beginning of the temple's construction and destruction. If it is customary for people in that locale to date their documents in this manner, it is acceptable. If this is not a local custom, it is unacceptable. And today the conventional custom for all gittin is that it writes only the Hebrew date from the creation of Adam and Eve. It has already become the universal Jewish custom to date gittin from the time of creation and from the crowning of Alexander the Great, which is the accepted means of dating for legal documents. That's what we use. If one dates the get according to the years of a contemporary kingdom, it is acceptable only in the kingdom, in the country over which that kingdom rules. The following rules apply when a person tells 2 Galims, write a get for my wife, sign it, and give it to her. And the matter was delayed several days or years, or the get was discovered that contained an imperfection, causing it to be considered void. And it was necessary to write a new get that was acceptable, as will be explained. In such an instance, the date and the place when and where the get was written and recorded are not the date and place where and when the husband told him to compose the get. What does this mean? If the husband told him to write the get in Jerusalem in the month of Tishrei, and the agents delayed and did not write it until Nisan, at which time they were located in Lud, the get should be dated in Nisan, and Lud should be recorded as its place. For this is where the get was written, and this is also the practice with regard to other legal documents, that the way that the date should be formatted. Any questions? First, I have a question for all of you. How's your Purim going? Good.
Going fine, except that I couldn't connect to any Megillah reading last night. I tried all the different sites that had been provided, but
you have Zoom.
wouldn't. Yes, everything.
I'm going to post now. I'm laning Megillah in a half an hour, so I'll post it in the chat box over here.
Thank you. Thank you.
If I can ask a question to all of you, how would 9 a.m. be on Fridays every week?
Yeah, should be okay.
Fine with me.
No, it should be all right.
That work for you, Kent?
Yeah, I was just thinking, no, I think that would be okay. Thanks, Rabbi. It's a matter of just getting used to it. As much as I try to remember to be here on time, I missed it. Although, in fairness, I just came back from shul, so yeah.
Sorry about that. Okay, so I'll let you know. Let me just
Yeah, just send a reminder, please. That's
I
all.
will send I'll send a reminder every week, but I'll post it on the when I post the group now. But I'm just going to post here for those who want to hear the Megillah now. I'm going to post the information. So the program starts at 9:15. If you want to copy and paste this onto your computer, 9:30 I'll be starting the full Megillah.
Thank you, Rabbi, and Chag Sameach, Purim Sameach, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Everyone. Shalom. Take care.
Shalom.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.